What is an indifference curve? To understand indifference curve, you must first understand what utility is. There is a whole video on utility analysis on this channel. However, in short, utility is just the one satisfying power inhibited in the commodity. In other words, you can think about utility as a measure of benefit that any commodity might give you. Now, things like satisfaction and utility cannot be measured cardinally, meaning we cannot give it numbers and say an apple gives me 10 more units of utility than a mango. But we can just say that an apple gives me more utility than a mango. In general, talking about things like utility in cardinal terms doesn't make sense. However, for the sake of understanding indifference curve, we will assume that we can give cardinal measurement to utility. Okay, let's start. Say one day you go to a supermarket with ₹100 to buy apples and mangoes. Apples cost ₹10, whereas mangoes cost ₹5. Ideally, you buy fruits that give you at least 200 units of utility with ₹100. And this is what you wish to do now as well. Now, you know that one apple gives you 20 units of utility and one mango gives you 10 units of utility. So, if you buy 5 apples and 10 mangoes, you will end up having 200 units of utility. You have spent ₹100 and gained 200 units of utility. That's great. But wait a minute. What if you go to the market and find out that there are only 4 apples left? Well, not to worry, you say. I can buy 4 apples and 12 mangoes. This way again, I'll be spending my ₹100 and gaining 200 units of utility. I can have many combinations like this. I can buy 6 apples and 8 mangoes and still gain 200 units of utility. No pun intended, but if you join these points, you'll see the point. An indifference curve is nothing but a locus of all points that keeps you on the same level of utility by letting you substitute between the two commodities. An indifference curve helps to understand consumer preferences. In general, it helps to study what actions a consumer might take so that he doesn't have to lose any utility that he derives from spending his money.
Indifference curves are lines in a coordinate system for which each of its points express a particular combination of a number of goods or bundles of goods that the consumer is indifferent to consume. The x-axis or horizontal axis shows the amount of good X a consumer can consume, while the y-axis, or vertical axis, shows the amount of good Y this consumer can consume. This indifference curve will therefore join all the different bundles of these goods that will report the same utility. This way, the consumer will be indifferent between choosing bundle A or bundle B. Remember, the consumer will be indifferent between any point along the curve as it will report him the same degree of utility. The relation between the amount of good X the consumer has to give up in order to be able to consume more goods Y is known as the marginal rate of substitution between these goods. The slope at each point of the curve will show this relation. The indifference curves, as we move away from the origin of coordinates, imply higher consumption and therefore increasing levels of utility. When able to choose, the consumer will always try to obtain the indifference curve that gives him the highest utility. A graph showing different combinations of indifference curves is known as an indifference map. However, not all indifference maps are the same, since the indifference curves may have different shapes. This second indifference map shows us the case for goods or bundles of goods, which are perfect substitutes, since the lines are parallel and marginal rate of substitution is equal to 1. That is, the slope has an angle of 45 degrees with each axis. It can also be the case for goods or bundles of goods that are perfect substitutes but in different proportions. Lastly, this graph shows an indifference map with 3 indifference curves that represent perfect complementary goods. This means there will not be an increase on the consumer's utility unless both goods increase in the required proportion. The best example of complementary goods are shoes, since the consumer's utility will not increase when he or she gets a new right shoe without getting a new left shoe. Notice that the elbows are collinear, and the line crossing them defines the proportion in which each good needs to increase in order to have an increase in the utility. In this case, the horizontal fragment of each indifference curve has a marginal rate of substitution equal to 0, and the vertical fractions a marginal rate of substitution equal to infinite. It's worth mentioning that this analysis of indifference curves can also be applied to production. In that case, the marginal rate of substitution turns into marginal rate of technical substitution and marginal rate of transformation.
Indifference curves and indifference schedule. Definition of indifference curve. An indifference curve represents all the possible combination of two goods which will give the same level of satisfaction. Assumptions. Scale of preferences. Consumers' preferences are transitivity, rationality, and diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Definition of indifference schedule. An indifference schedule is a list of combination of two goods that give equal satisfaction to the consumer. It shows the indifference curve. An indifference curve represents all those combination of two goods, X and Y, which earn the same level of satisfaction to a consumer. Indifference map. An indifference map shows a set of indifference curve. The higher the indifference curve from the origin, higher will be the utility. Indifference curve P has the higher satisfaction. The characteristics of indifference curve. Indifference curve slopes downward from left to right. Indifference curve are convex to the origin. Higher indifference curve represents higher level of satisfaction. Indifference curve never intersects each other. Indifference curve does not touch the y-axis or x-axis.